everyone, my name is Jeff Rolka. Thank you for checking out my video. I had a request for some specific holiday-themed aspects to a warm-up video, and this is that video. There's some different exercises in here, ones that we don't normally cover. I'm doing this for all voices. I'll give you starting notes to help out as best I can. Sometimes it'll be just hanging on and getting in as it comes into a good range for you. As is my custom, I won't really talk very much at all in this video, except to give you different vowels or different aspects of the exercise that I think are important just to help you, basically. So aside from that, thank you if you've chosen to subscribe. Thank you to my Patreon supporters. I truly appreciate your support. Let me turn the keyboard on here so that you can see what we're doing. We're going to begin with the lip trill octaves. Oftentimes in music of this season, we get a lot of octave skips. Also, if you are singing a song and all of a sudden it gets too high, getting some practice at skipping down the octave can be very, very useful. I'm going to start this low and work our way up. You may start along with us here. Sopranos and mezzos, you might want to, you could try it at the octave, but you might just wait for a moment and then get in as it comes into a good range for you. Contraltos, you might be fine to start with here. Tenors and baritones, all in. We're doing the lip trill to start. And what you want to try to do in this exercise is stay vocalized to the top pitch. That is our beginning and end. It is our target pitch. We're going to do this exercise a couple times and we're going to flip it around. And you have to try to remember what that feels like. And one more, and maybe one more, and all right, now let's go back to the beginning here. Again, stay vocalized to the upper pitch, E, and couple more, and A and ah. A, ah. And and, 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 A and O. A, O. And. 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 Now we're going to reverse it. Try to remember what that top note felt like in the previous exercise. Anticipate that openness. Anticipate the energy required for it. Lip trill. And. 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 E. Anticipate the increase in engagement, in firmness of the abdominal musculature. Anticipate the openness. Light on the bottom. Be lighter on the bottom. E. And. 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 And ah. The difficulty here will be making sure that ah narrows as you descend. A and ah, and. and O. A, O. Similar to A and Ah, descending and narrowing will be tricky. And. 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 One more. And. Switching back to the lip trill, we're going to do thirds first. Start you here. One more time. Sopranos and mezzos, you might start there. And. And one more time. And. And again. And. All right, I had a request for long eighth note passages. I hope that leaf blower isn't too prevalent in this tracking, by the way, as well. Those things are really loud. They're like super loud. Anyway, we're going to switch back to the lip trill again here. A long eighth note passage, similar to a lot of what you'll find in the repertoire of this season. So start there with a lip trill. And one more. And now, in truth, you could use any vowel you like. We're going to go through a couple variants here. Let's start with E. E is the narrowest forward-facing vowel. It will require modification as you ascend up the octave, but it should give you pretty good efficiency too. A. A and ah. So we'll alternate between the two. And alternating, like A and ah. And there you go. As always, I hope this helps. This time of year, the repertoire just has very specific kinds of requirements, and exercises specific to those requirements can be very, very useful, and I hope that they serve you well. I do hope that the leaf blower is not too intrusive in this lesson, and I apologize if it's at all distracting. Until next time, I should say, before I go, as I am normally wont to do, happiest of holidays. However you choose to celebrate this season, I hope that you have a wonderful, wonderful celebration. Friends and family are there if you want them to be, and that you're just having a lovely time. Thank you so very much for being a part of the channel and watching, subscribing, sharing, supporting. It is all greatly appreciated. Thank you so very much. Have a wonderful season. Take care. Take really good care of your voices. And we'll see you next time. Bye.